Welcome to the Unbroken Arrows podcast. I'm Greg, and today I'm flying solo. Catherine should be back next week. This week we're going to be talking about aquatic invasive species. And aquatic invasive species are non-native plants, animals, and other organisms that have evolved to live primarily in water rather than on land. This is an issue not just for us that live here in South Dakota, but it truly is an issue that goes from coast to coast. What I want to do today is take the opportunity to try to educate everyone that may be going outdoors, whether it's boating, hiking, fishing, any of those types of things. You don't want to be a vector for an aquatic invasive species. In other words, you don't want to be a person that helps lead to an infestation to, in this case, other bodies of water. Today my guest is Tanner Davis. And Tanner is the statewide Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks. Tanner, welcome to the Unbroken Arrows podcast.
Hi, and thanks for having me today.
I'm happy that you could find the time to visit with me today. For our conversation, I'm going to focus on a couple that I know that are prevalent in South Dakota and this particular region, the 5-state area. I would say South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, maybe even into Wisconsin. I'm not as familiar with some of those things the further east we go. According to some of the research that I've come across, the two aquatic invasive species that I find the most information about in South Dakota are zebra mussels and silver carp. Is that accurate with regard to what the game fish and parks are looking at in terms of aquatic invasive species?
Yes, we spend the most time with zebra mussels and invasive carp, primarily silver carp. We do monitor for other aquatic invasive species, and as we talk further, I'll reference those as AIS here in South Dakota, but I would say that we focus most of our time on zebra mussels and invasive carp.
Okay. Now, if I remember right, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think silver carp, which are under the umbrella of Asian carp, which there are more species than just the silver carp, but wasn't this a species that was introduced someplace in the United States to help clean up algae in bodies of water?
Yeah, so their historical name was Asian carp for that larger umbrella. They're now deemed invasive carp, and that would include your silver carp, bighead carp, black carp, and grass carp.
Okay.
And they were first introduced into Arkansas back in 1973 for the purpose of controlling phytoplankton in catfish production ponds, reservoirs, and sewage lagoons. But unfortunately, due to flooding, they were able to escape out of those closed off areas and made their way up the Mississippi River, which they eventually made their way into South Dakota.
Okay. In what ways then the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, what are they doing to work on controlling the silver carp?
Good question. Yeah, so we are part of the sub-basin for the Missouri River. There's several sub-basins within the U.S. that get federal funding to help understand and control these populations as we move forward. And so for South Dakota, we've been involved with this effort now for roughly 5 years. And right now we're kind of in the infancy stage of that effort, where we're just trying to better understand these populations and the risks that are posed by these invasive carp. So some of the projects that we've worked on thus far are trying to understand their movement. So we put out acoustic telemetry arrays in the Missouri River main stem, as well as our 3 main tributaries, the Big Sioux River, Vermilion River, and James River, to try to better understand their movements throughout the year, in hopes that at one point, if it does seem plausible to either put up a barrier or to have some sort of removal effort or a partnership in regards to a removal effort, that we would have our best understanding of their movement to try to be as efficient as possible with that effort. We've also conducted assessment of risk via live bait trade. So we had a graduate student up at South Dakota State University look at the risk associated with live bait in our bait shops across the Missouri River Basin, and they were looking for environmental DNA to indicate some sort of presence either in the body of water where this bait was collected or potentially at the bait store itself where an angler may inadvertently spread that invasive carp to a new body of water if they were to, let's say, dump their bait into the body of water that they were fishing at. We're also looking at other things such as quantifying the habitat connectivity in the Dakotas and looking at when flood events occur, where and when these are connecting to other subbasins or other major travel corridors for invasive carp, and then also looking at habitat suitability. So if these carp were to get into new areas, what is the possibility for them to stay alive in these new areas and potentially recruit and reproduce in these new bodies of water? And then one other study that we're looking at is one of our Game Fish and Parks employees here is actually getting their PhD through South Dakota State University, and they're looking at otolith microchemistry to identify natal origins and movement within the Missouri River Basin. So that study is primarily trying to figure out where these fish are spawning at and where these young a year first showing up at to try to hone in on some of their spawning habitats in the Missouri River Basin.
So Tanner, in 1973, these carp were introduced into ponds, commercial ponds in Arkansas, and they have become prolific in different regions, and the Missouri River Basin is one of those. Do you have any type of estimate in terms of the population of this fish that has been, it's essentially 51 years, I guess, since they've been introduced?
To give you an accurate number overall, I wouldn't be able to provide that, but once they are introduced into a new body of water, such as a riverine system where their primary habitat would be, they take up to 50% of the fish biomass in that system once they do become established.
That's incredible. The other thing that goes along with the silver carp is the actual hazard that comes along with them. My co-host of the Unbroken Arrows podcast, Catherine, also my stepdaughter, they were archery fishing for silver carp, and the behavior of this fish is that they jump out of water. And she actually got hit in the back of the leg by one that jumped out of the water and into the boat. And I hear of people that get knocked out of boats because of these fish jumping. What are the kinds of things like that you've heard or that you're familiar with that there's that danger of them being in that body of water where people are either fishing or just for water recreation?
Silver carp primarily are the ones that you hear of that are referenced as flying carp or jumping carp, and they have very sensitive hearing. So when they hear loud noises, that might even be a slap of your paddle when you're kayaking or your boat motor, their immediate reaction is wanting to flee from that area. So they jump out of the water, and they can jump several feet, up to 7 feet out of the water, and that can create many hazards. It can potentially concuss a boater and, God forbid, but, potentially knock out the driver of that boat, which could be very dangerous. So in some areas where they've gotten into lake systems that are connected to river systems, they've actually put no wake zones in places to try to prevent some of that damage occurring to our recreationalists, and definitely can be hazardous at times. I've seen it before where you see several hundred silver carp jumping all at the same time, and there's definitely a risk there when recreating.
Okay, one of the ways that I've heard that was an idea for controlling these silver carp in particular was the push to rename it and to have it commercially harvested for the restaurant industry. And I think the name they settled on, this has been a couple of years ago, and I haven't really heard a lot about it recently, but Kopi, I think, is what they settled on. And from my research, that's just kind of a play on words, that they're copious. There's so many of these that's why they came up with that name. But first off, I guess, are you familiar with that movement to try to brand it as a different name that could be maybe sold as a item on a menu at a restaurant? And if so, do you think that's a possible way to control the species.
Yeah, potentially, and you're exactly right. So that word copy was deemed, for the abundance of them, the copious amount of carp. And unfortunately, the word carp has some negative connotations to it, where people just automatically assume that these fish do not taste good because common carp aren't the most palatable fish in our river systems. So rebranding this fish to the word copy, they were hoping to kind of entice folks to consider this as a food option, and not only in restaurants but also major food chains across the nation. And they were trying to make a market for these fish, so there would be more incentive for additional commercial harvest to occur that could help reduce these populations on the landscape overall. There was quite a bit of effort pushed towards this, and I don't think they got as much traction as they wanted to. They're still dealing with some feasibility issues with just keeping it food grade and keeping these fish cold once they get off these commercial harvesting boats. And they've been very creative. I mean, they even have these ice trucks that come right to the boat landing that dump these fish in there to make sure that these fish fillets stay fresh. And they've also started to use it for fish fertilizer, dog food, and they're actually processing it to use as cut bait, where there would be no risk for spreading it through that route. So they are getting more creative with how to utilize these fish to try to help promote a market to help reduce these populations. But unfortunately, this initial effort to rebrand these fish to get them in our large box stores for food chains hasn't been as productive as we'd like, but that effort is still ongoing.
Okay. Well, in some of the things that I've read about Kopi, one described it as more savory than tilapia, which I'm not a huge fan of tilapia, so that's not a big draw for me. But less muddy tasting than catfish, and more firm than cod. You know, some of those things, like the firmer it is, I think the potential is for a better tasting fillet. But I think with carp, from my understanding of catching carp, common carp, when I was young, and my uncle loved to catch carp and he smoked it, but they're a bony fish. So just the average person that is catching these, having the understanding as to how to clean them, well, just like a northern. I mean, a northern is a delicious tasting fish, but they're bony with the Y bones. And unless you know how to clean them, you're going to be picking bones out of what you're eating. Are there any tutorials, I guess? I've never looked for this, like on YouTube or someplace. Or are there any resources for the recreational fishermen to learn how to clean silver carp if they wanted to try that at home?
Yes, our first AIS coordinator actually put on a video on our South Dakota Game Fish and Parks YouTube page on this exact topic. In that video, they show you how to clean a silver carp. And as you mentioned, you know, these silver carp, invasive carp as a whole, they're actually very healthy. One of the healthiest fish to eat in the river system because they grow so quickly, and because of what they're eating, they accumulate very little heavy metals in their fillets. So although they are and can be very bony with silver carp, they're larger bones, so it's not something that you would potentially find lodged in your throat, similar to like a Y bone in a northern pike. So they may be bony, but they are a very white flushed meat, and you can create the flavor that you'd like with the seasonings you use on them. And anyone that I know that have tasted silver carp before have always said good things about them. So I would encourage all folks to give it a try and make up their own opinion on silver carp, but they are a very healthy fish to eat in our river system and very plentiful.
Okay. So we can check that video out. Is it still on the website now, on the Game Fish and Parks website?
Yes.
Good. So that'll be something that I'll need to look into then. Thanks for that information. Now back to controlling it. I am a subscriber to Outdoor News, the Minnesota edition of Outdoor News, and there was an article in a past issue about a joint effort between the Minnesota and the Wisconsin DNR in an effort to capture the invasive carp, and the result of that was they captured 323 invasive carp. 296 of those were silver carp. And one of the most interesting bits of information that I gleaned from that article was that they used some type of tag, and I can't remember if it was a GPS type receiver or a some type of radio telemetry, but they used the tag fish to find the areas that they wanted to capture, and I do believe they used nets to capture these fish because they're a schooling fish. So if you find one, you should probably find more. That particular type of technology use in trying to control these invasive carp kind of intrigues me. Is that something that the South Dakota Game and Parks is experimenting with as well?
Yes. That acoustic telemetry is a very popular tool that many researchers are utilizing today, and we have acoustic receivers up and down the main stem of the Missouri River, and we collaborate with multiple state agencies on distributing that information when folks go out there and pull that data. So how that works is a small receiver or a small acoustic tag is put into the body cavity of these invasive carp. It's roughly the size of a AA battery that's surgically implanted into the body cavity of a silver carp, and then they are then released into the river system. And then if they swim by one of our passive receivers that are mounted on the substrate of the river and cabled off, if they go within a certain distance of them, it will ping that frequency from that tag, and that receiver will collect that data. And then periodically, folks will go out there and lift up those receivers and pull that data and download that. And then we can then see their movement over time. There's also radio telemetry that's used more in the active use, where folks would actually be driving down the river and they'll try to find these specific fish in an effort to retrieve them. But both are very helpful, and we utilize those for not only invasive carp, but other species such as sturgeon that are threatened in the Missouri River Basin.
Okay. Now, I'm originally from Nebraska, and I probably about 10 miles from the Missouri River on the Nebraska side down by Niobrara way. But the Missouri River has multiple dams. So do the dams like, say, the Space or the Lewis and Clark Lake, as it's backed up to Fort Randall Dam, so the area between Gavin's Point and Fort Randall, does having a dam like that and being able to work with a segment of the river, is that beneficial trying to control an invasive species like the Asian carp, or is that detrimental?
So, as mentioned before, and I would encourage everyone to start utilizing the new terminology for these fish. They're deemed invasive carp now. In all new literature, you'll see that used as well. But currently, Gavin's Point Dam is a known barrier to silver carp on the Missouri River main stem. So to our knowledge, at this point, we do not have any silver carp above Gavin's Point Dam, which would be right there in Yankton, South Dakota. Mm-hmm. That's one of our major barriers here in South Dakota. And then we have a couple other barriers, being the Vermilion Spillway at Lake Vermilion, just west of Sioux Falls, and the Falls in Sioux Falls is another known barrier for silver carp to not go upstream on the Big Sioux River here in South Dakota. Unfortunately, the James River doesn't have any permanent barriers, so silver carp have the ability to get all the way up to Jamestown, North Dakota in the James River.
So with barriers like that are very successful in keeping the migration northward, for example, the ones you gave, Gavin's Point and the Falls. So that means some of the research that you mentioned earlier about going into the bait shops, for example, making sure that there's not bait getting accidentally transferred, and also the fact that being able to educate people on what not to do with regard to transporting live fish, whether it be in live wells or those kinds of things, that becomes all the more important, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And we are actually, that same graduate student that did that study is now doing a PhD currently up at South Dakota State University to try to better understand what are the best ways to communicate with the public with multiple issues at play, language barriers, just where they're utilizing our resources, that information that they would need to have, how we can best present that to them, whether that's at the bait shops, online, in person, we are currently studying that to try to better communicate with our public, to better educate them so folks aren't inadvertently spreading these, and they are more aware of our state's regulations on what you can and cannot do with the fish they obtain.
Well, Tanner, I want to shift gears here a little bit and start talking about zebra mussels. And zebra mussels, for those that aren't aware, are a small mollusk. And zebra mussels were first found in the Great Lakes, and we'll talk a little bit later about how they made their way into the Great Lakes. But zebra mussels have the ability to grow and reproduce at a very high rate. One of the issues that zebra mussels bring is they are very voracious feeders, filter feeders, and they can get a lot of the nutrients from the water out, and since they're in such high numbers, they really do have an impact on the nutrients available then for native species in bodies of waters. Another thing that they do is I guess I would say that it would be a behavior that allows them to actually feed more efficiently. They have the tendency to attach themselves into infrastructure like pipes, where they would be intake water lines, say for water systems in larger cities or larger areas, and they clog these intake pipes. So they are impacting both sport and commercial fisheries, and in an area where there's an infested, the shells are sharp too. So if you're in a body of water where zebra mussels are found and they are, in, say, the rocks that may be near shore and you're walking barefoot, you have a very good chance of cutting your feet. So it's dangerous to humans that way. But primarily, they take a body of water and, I guess in my words, they make it too clean. They rob so much of the nutrient for the native species of probably both fish and invertebrate species in the water that some of the fish populations and the health of the overall body of water goes downhill, and goes downhill pretty quick. So, Tanner, when were the zebra mussels first identified or found in South Dakota?
They were first confirmed in 2014 in Lewis and Clark Lake.
Okay. And in those cases, what would be the speculation as to how the zebra mussels found their way, well, from the Great Lakes across many states, as far as Lewis and Clark Lake would be concerned, that it's quite a few miles. What's the hypothesis, I guess, that would be for that journey?
Yeah. Research shows that watercraft movement is the highest risk for spread for zebra mussels. So as folks are recreating from one water body to the next, some folks aren't always using their best management practices on staying clean, drain, dry, and folks can inadvertently spread those from one water body to the next, either from the mud that they're pulling up on their anchor, or vegetation that's hanging on their boat or trailer, or water that's in their live well, ballast tanks. These are all risks for spreading aquatic invasive species, and that has been shown to be the highest risk for spread, especially relating to zebra mussels.
Okay, so you heard my rendition of how zebra mussels impact bodies of water, lakes and rivers that they infest. Would you add to what I mentioned with regard to how an infestation of zebra mussels impact lakes?
Sure, yeah, and you did a pretty good job there. There are definitely more negatives than positives when it comes to a new infestation of zebra mussels into a water body. And a few of the things that most times you will see over time is that water visibility will increase. Each one of these mussels are filtering a liter of water per day, and an adult female mussel, which is reproducing at age 1, can give off 1 million eggs per year. Now, there is a high mortality with those eggs as they develop into adults, over 90%, but that's still looking at 100,000 mussels per female once they are reproducing in a system. And they will attach on to one another as well. So over time, they can actually end up killing their oldest individuals in the population because they're suffocated by these younger zebra mussels, but they're also attaching onto our native mussels and killing them because they don't have the ability to move or filter effectively. But when they are filtering this water, as you mentioned, they are filtering out our nutrients out of the water column that our game species, when they are first hatched in that first year of life, need zooplankton and phytoplankton, but also our planktivores, so paddlefish, gizzard shad, which is a primary prey resource for our game fish on the Missouri River need. And some of the misinformation out there is that zebra mussels clean the water, and the word clean is an inaccurate term for what they're doing. They're removing nutrients out of the water column, and over time, water visibility will increase, and then light is penetrating deeper into our waters, which is allowing for more plant production in deeper water where historically did not have the ability to grow in because there was no light touching the substrate. And so not only is that light penetrating deeper and we're creating more vegetation, but with that light penetrating deeper, it's also warming our water bodies. So it's not creating as suitable of an atmosphere for species such as walleye, and it's creating more of a warming effect on our waters, which is more conducive for our bass and bluegill populations. And as most people know, walleye is king here in South Dakota, so we definitely don't want to see that overall. And some people may see a bump up in fish production those first few years when we're seeing more vegetation, but over time, you might have a hard time, pulling plugs in 15 to 20 feet of water because you have vegetation growing in your main basin of your water body, where historically that was never the case. So it creates for more difficult fishing. It is also not very conducive for some of our major game species that we have here in South Dakota. It can create less recreational opportunities. One thing that we've had report to us this year is that folks that are swimming in the water are even getting their legs cut because these zebra mussels are attaching onto the standing vegetation in the water. And as that vegetation pulls off their legs as they're swimming through it, these sharp mussel shells are actually cutting their legs. So it's not only a risk when you're standing on zebra mussel beds, but also those mussels that are attaching onto the vegetation. So as a whole, they're definitely not good for our water bodies. And with that filtering effect, they're also bioaccumulating these heavy metals such as mercury, and other species are consuming these zebra mussels such as crayfish, catfish, drum, and then some of our bigger predator fish such as walleyes, bass, northern are eating these species, and then that is bioaccumulating those heavy metals in our game fish, which then over time could be less healthy to consume. And we haven't seen that data yet in South Dakota, thankfully, but some research has seen that in other states. So it's something that we're definitely looking out for and monitoring. But overall, I would never advocate to anyone to have zebra mussels into their body of water. Over time, it's definitely not going to improve your fisheries.
Again, that's one of the reasons why educating people with regard to that, to not be a vector for spreading any type of aquatic invasive species. And the zebra mussel is one that's just shows how everything is connected. That food web that you just described with regard to heavy metals passing through the food chain, and of course that stays in the flesh of the fish. Oftentimes people just don't realize just the great impact that one thing may have on others right on down that food chain or food web, however you want to describe that. Now, are there techniques to eradicate zebra mussels once they're in a body of water, or is it one of those things that once they are in a body, you want to try to control the population from really exploding?
Yeah, so there's been multiple attempts at trying to eradicate zebra mussels, and unless they're found super early in their introduction, which is oftentimes infeasible, by the time that you see the zebra mussels, probably already been there for a year or two, and you're seeing that first cohort from the parents that were introduced. A few things that folks have tried to do is like tarping shorelines to not allow these mussels to filter, or using molluscicide to treat them, such as Earth-Tech QZ or Zequinot. And then another one that they're using now is carbon dioxide for a little bit more of a neutral effect on our water bodies and not using chemicals to treat them. And overall, there's been very little success with eradicating them, but there are measures that people can take to help mitigate their presence. For example, water treatment plants using Urtec UZ in their pipe systems to not allow zebra mussels to clog their intakes, having more negative impacts on their infrastructure at their water treatment plants. Same thing that goes for agricultural uses, using something such as that to not prevent that intake of water to irrigate our farm fields here in the Midwest. But eradication as a whole has not been overall feasible to date, but there is a lot of research going on currently, especially over in Minnesota at MACERC, where they're making gains, but we're just not there yet. One thing that has been a new scientific milestone is that they've mapped the genome of the zebra mussel, and this will definitely help with future efforts to try to eradicate them. And that's why it's so important right now that we're slowing the spread as much as we can. So when we do have that nail in the coffin answer on how to actually truly eradicate these from these water bodies, we don't have to do that on every one of our water bodies that we have in the state, because we have the ability to slow that spread down until the science catches up.
Okay, one of the techniques that I've observed, and this is one of those things that on the personal side of things, I think if I've got this question, maybe other people that might be listening have these questions, but one of the techniques that I've observed are the watercraft check stations. When I drive down on I-29, I will see from time to time a watercraft check station, usually during the summer, obviously. But what are the procedures that are conducted at those check stations?
Yeah, so we have various check stations across the state. We are specifically looking for any presence of aquatic invasive species. We are getting kind of a boater history to see whether or not this boat that we're looking at is either high risk or low risk, depending on the water bodies they have been utilizing. We're making sure that all their plugs are pulled and that there's no standing water in there that could be housing aquatic invasive species such as zebra mussel larvae, which are called velgers. We're also making sure that there's no hanging vegetation on the boat or trailer or any mud in their anchor compartment that would also be potentially housing aquatic invasive species such as New Zealand mud snail in that mud. The best way to communicate with folks is face-to-face, research has shown. So we utilize our watercraft inspection stations to help educate folks and to make sure that they are staying compliant with our rules and regulations here in South Dakota. And in South Dakota, it is a law that you have to have your plug pulled when you are not launching or loading your boat. So once you leave the parking ramp area adjacent to your water body that you're utilizing, that plug has to be pulled. So we utilize our watercraft inspection stations overall just to help educate folks and to make sure that we're not inadvertently spreading these aquatic invasive species on our landscape.
Is there anything that an individual can do? For example, people sometimes will fish one lake in the morning and then go load their boat, go have lunch someplace, and then go fish another lake in the afternoon. Now, draining the plugs and those types of things are, and emptying your live well, are techniques to help not inadvertently spread not just zebra mussel larvae, but other invasive species, aquatic species. Is there anything that an individual boater can do to help in additional ways of not being that vector of spreading an aquatic invasive species? Is there a solution that somebody, a home remedy type thing that somebody could mix up in a tank that could, spray, that would probably not fix everything, but would help out, or anything else like that?
Well, the best way to kill off any aquatic invasive species is hot water, actually. And we really advocate that so we're not polluting our waters or our soil. Unfortunately, zebra mussels have the ability to close their shells and to not take in harsh chemicals such as bleach. But bleach, if they do consume it, would kill them. But vinegar is another more milder treatment that you can use to kill zebra mussel larvae or small zebra mussels. But I would argue that removing all the vegetation off of your boat from one water body to the next is going to be the best help with preventing the spread of aquatic invasive plants and zebra mussels, because adult zebra mussels are attaching onto these aquatic plants, and it's a lot easier for an adult mussel to take hold in a new water body than it is, for example, a zebra mussel veloster or their larval stage, which they have a lot more higher mortality in regards to establishing themselves in a new water body. The other thing folks should be doing is either carrying a sponge with them or a towel and drying out those compartments to the best of their ability past just pulling the plug. We also have the boaters lower their motor. One of the things that folks should start practicing when they're leaving a body of water is the first thing they should do is lower their motor to drain that water out, and then pull their main drain plug, and then just do their quick inspection around their watercraft to make sure that they're not housing any other aquatic invasive species or plants or mud. And then once they finish that inspection, which should only take a minute or two, that water should be drained out of their motor, and then they can lift that back up and put it on their motor mount. And that's kind of what we showcase at our watercraft inspection stations and help educate them on what they can do to help minimize the spread.
Okay. Kayaking is a popular activity and becoming more popular, and in fact we have two. And actually what was the antecedent to me contacting you was one Sunday afternoon driving on I-29 south. I saw one of the watercraft stations setting up, and it just dawned on me. I wondered if I'm kayaking and I'm hauling my kayaks from one body of water to the other, or just from being in one body of water home. Do people that are hauling kayaks, should they stop at those watercraft checkpoint stations? And I'm assuming that it is something that you use in the water, just like a jet ski or a jet boat or your any type of an inboard or outboard watercraft. So is that suggested for people to stop and again, more than anything, get educated about potentially spreading aquatic invasive species?
Yes, and to be frank, it's actually not a suggestion. It is mandatory for kayaks to stop. All watercraft, so anything that floats, including paddle boards, they need to be stopping at our watercraft inspection stations. And a few things that we see very frequently on the landscape is that boaters are uneducated that jet skis have plugs, kayaks can have plugs, and that, as you have questioned, whether or not they need to stop, and that is the case. Anything that floats is considered a watercraft. It would just be considered a hand-launched watercraft. So they do pose a very low risk, but there is still a risk associated with that type of watercraft. So they should be stopping when they see an inspection station. And if a conservation officer is present and someone does not stop, there's a high likelihood that they will get pulled over and either have them brought back to the inspection station or get inspected on the side of the road by the conservation officer themselves.
Okay, that was one of my questions, was what happens if they don't stop then, if they're pulling any type of a watercraft? Again, it's not so much that the goal is to ticket somebody for that, it's more to educate them.
Absolutely. Education is our primary focus. Outreach and education is our primary focus for slowing the spread of aquatic invasive species. We don't write enough tickets to make up for the cost associated with it, but we do see it as an important management activity on the landscape is to conduct these watercraft inspection stations. We can't be everywhere all the time, so that's why we want to help educate folks, so when we don't see them out in the landscape, they remember what they should be doing to help minimize the spread.
And I'm one of those people that I would say I'm a rule follower. Again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is to ask that particular question with regard to those check stations, because again, it's an effort to educate and help the future of the environment with regard to water and water recreation and water sports, not something to deter it.
Absolutely. And just to add a little bit there, with you mentioning that you are just on the Nebraska side, one difference in regulations is in Nebraska is that once you are clean, drain, dry, you can put your plug back in. And so we do see that as frequent violation here in South Dakota, is that some of the boaters are uneducated that plug needs to be out at all times in South Dakota if you're not on it at the water body you're utilizing. So just a a helpful reminder there to make sure that that plug is pulled at all times, even if your boat is dry and cleaned. In fact, if you do see a watercraft inspection station, just make sure you do your part and stop. And the inspection process is very quick and easy. Our inspectors are doing thousands of inspections every summer per station, and they'll try to get you on the way as soon as possible.
Okay, Tanner, are there any other invasive species that South Dakota Fish, Game, and Parks have a plan of action for?
So we actually conduct an aquatic invasive species survey in conjunction with our lake surveys across the state. So we are monitoring for other aquatic invasive species, for example, invasive plants, curly leaf pondweed, Eurasian water milfoil, brittle naiad are some examples of other aquatic invasive species that we're looking for out in the landscape. And we try to help educate users by having various signage on our landscape. So for example, our invasive species alert sign will be an 18 by 24 inch sign at our boat landings that will showcase any aquatic invasive species that we have in that water body. There'll be a 3.5 by 7 inch sticker with that species listed on there. And this helps educate boaters on what they might need to look out for when they're utilizing that water body. And this sign is actually the same sign that Minnesota DNR uses to help kind of unify that approach so folks are familiar with what they need to be looking for out there. So if you ever are wondering about any aquatic invasive species information, any orange sign that you see on the landscape would be indicative of aquatic invasive species signage.
And the point I think I want to try to dovetail to what you just said was that, you have young people maybe just starting out buying their first boat, their first watercraft, canoe, whatever the kayak, whatever it might be. Or you might, the point of our podcast is to encourage people to go out, enjoy the outdoors, no matter what activity it is, whether it's hunting, fishing, hiking, just enjoying a walk through an area where there's native wildflowers, whatever the case might be. But this topic or this conversation might be a little overwhelming for somebody, I have to look out for this, I have to look out for that. The thing that I want to point out is that regardless of whether we're talking about South Dakota Game Fish and Parks or the Minnesota, Wisconsin, DNR, Nebraska Game Fish and Parks, no matter what state agency, they are there to help you out. They want to encourage you to enjoy the outdoors, just like we're doing on our podcast. And it's not overwhelming in terms of what you need to do and what you can do to help. And it's not just aquatic invasive species. We've got terrestrial invasive species, plants, animals, and insects, and all those kinds of things too. It's just part of what our world is right now. But use the resources that you have available to you. And I haven't met a conservation officer or a game and parks official or a Department of Natural Resources official that doesn't want to help first. So my hat's off to all of those agencies and to anybody listening that might think this is overwhelming. Use them as a resource. They're there for you.
Absolutely. And if anyone wants any more information on aquatic invasive species in South Dakota, you can visit our website, which is sdleastwanted.sd.gov. If you go through one of our watercraft inspection stations, you will be handed a rack card that has information on how to stay clean, drain, dry, and what you can do to expedite your process coming through our inspection stations, and then also where you should be inspecting your watercraft for aquatic invasive species. Our website is very helpful. That website is listed on all of our aquatic invasive species signage, and it can really help folks understand where we have our AIS in the state and what they should be doing while out on our landscape to help conserve our waters and our land here in South Dakota. So as you mentioned, the overall goal with all state agencies is to just help conserve our resources. And if anyone ever has a question, I'm more than welcome them to reach out, and I can answer anything that they may have.
All right, one last question, and it may or may not be on topic here, but one of the things that I've seen for many years now, either at boat launch areas, bait shops, those types of places, or even posted just on lakes. But what about bait? Night crawlers, minnows, leeches, those types of things. One of the things that I think people sometimes mistakenly think is that you don't use a dozen full dozen of your night crawlers. I think there are some people that, toss them out in the backyard. Minnows in particular, if you don't use all your minnows. Leeches would be the same type of thing. What types of regulations or rules are there about trying to keep different types of bait to be introduced in areas that they're not native to?
Yeah, so it is illegal to dump your bait in South Dakota if it's not originating from that water body that it was collected. So if you're getting your bait from a bait shop, it is illegal to dump your bait in a water body when you are finished recreating for that day. We also have bait take restrictions in all of our moving water pretty much in eastern South Dakota to help minimize the risk of inadvertently collecting young of the year invasive carp and then spreading them to new water bodies when you're using your own bait traps. And that's something that we look for at our watercraft inspection stations, whether or not a boater has live bait on board. And we're primarily focusing on any bait that would be in water. There's a chance that you could have invasive crayfish in there, frogs. Bullfrogs actually have a lot of pathogens that can be very detrimental to other species. Minnows, you see a lot of bycatch in minnows at times, whether that be stickleback or just species that shouldn't be in there. So we're also looking at that to make sure that there isn't any unadvertised species in that bait bucket.
Well, Tanner, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today. All great information. And I think that it's one of the things that we can do in our podcast, for example, is to help educate people to enjoy nature, enjoy the outdoors for years and years to come. And agencies such as the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks are agencies that we love to partner with. And again, thank you for your time and all of the information that you shared. This is great stuff.
Thanks for having me on today, and hope you have a great day.
You too, Tanner. Thank you. If you or someone you know is thinking of suicide or is in need of crisis intervention, call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. Additionally, veterans and their loved ones can receive confidential crisis support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by dialing the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline 988, but then press 1 to be connected to the Veterans Crisis Line responder. To all of our listeners, take some time to get outside. Enjoy the outdoors and experience its healing powers. With that, on behalf of Catherine and me, until next time.